The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar, Aligning Product Strategy with Customer Feature Requests. My name is Andre Theus and I will be your moderator for today. As always, before we start, we would like to find out who's joining us today so we can specifically address the content in today's presentation to you. So I'm going to launch a quick poll and I would like to ask everybody to take a moment and answer the poll question here. So are you in product management or in marketing or in a sales organization? Are you working in an engineering or development department? Or are you a founder or executive or none of those? So please take a moment and take this poll. Looks like lots of you have done the poll. Thank you. Let me close it and share the results. Right on, it doesn't surprise me that a lot of you are in product management, 63%, followed by engineering development, and then a few other different functions. So it's fantastic. There will be specifically a lot of content for product managers, and then there's also a lot of agile software development related content. So this is the perfect webinar for you guys, so you're in for a treat. So before we start, this webinar is a team effort by the Product Stack. Product Stack is a community of product managers that are focused on helping you plan, execute, and measure your way to customer-centric products. And this group is brought to life by ProductPlan, a popular product management or product roadmap software, and Pivotal Tracker, an agile project management system, and Notion, the easiest tool to empower your team with data. And let me introduce you to today's panel. We have three very experienced product management veterans here. And best of all, they all will be sharing real examples that happened to all of them. First up is Dan Postit. Dan is a Pivotal Labs VP and General Manager of Pivotal Tracker, the popular project collaboration tool for modern software teams. Dan has been with Pivotal Labs since the nascent days in the mid-2000s and has experience in every aspect of software development, including engineering, product management, and UX design. Next up is Greg Goodman. Greg Goodman is the co-founder and CEO of ProductPlan. He has a passion for building products and companies. He was the founder of Miramar Systems, which was acquired by Computer Associates, and has advised and invested in numerous technology startups, including AppFolio, RightScale, HG Data, Appeal Science. He has a degree in computer science and business economics from UC Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
And then last but not least, we will hear from Kevin, and he is sharing his views on metrics. Kevin Steigerwald is co-founder and chief product officer at Notion. He's a full-stack product designer with over 10 years of experience designing, researching, marketing, planning, and building products. He's a busy guy. From package design in big box retailers to indie games in the App Store, his passion is for designing experiences that make our life easier and more enjoyable. He believes pies are for dessert, not for shards. Tortillas make the best utensil. And the iPhone 4 is the proper screen size for a phone. Welcome, Kevin. So today we'll be talking about that one feature request. I'm sure all of your product managers have been there. You have this perfect product vision. You created that beautiful roadmap and you have it all figured out. And then there is that customer or those customers that keep on asking that one feature that just doesn't align with your vision. Or you hear maybe something that is just asked by one customer, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes customer requests don't really align with your vision or don't really align with product strategy. So all speakers will be sharing their examples and their views, and hopefully will give you some practical advice how to go about it. So the agenda for today is we will first be hearing from Dan, who will be talking how customer feedback impacts your product vision. Then Greg will shed some light on how you can go about deciding what feature you actually should build. And Kevin will be sharing his advice on how you can use metrics to align your product strategy against feature requests. And then my most favorite part of webinars is the questions and answers. All of you guys are joining live and have an advantage for people who are just watching videos online. So I would highly encourage you to use the question panel and go to webinar and submit your question at any point in time. We have people online that are yielding all of those questions, and then we're going to pick through the questions and try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. We set aside about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So I would highly encourage you to submit your questions. So without further ado, let me hand it over to our first speaker, Dan Postit from Pivotal Tracker. Dan, please take it away.
Thank you, Andre. Excited to be here. Glad to see so many attendees. This is really exciting for us. So yeah, as Andre mentioned, I'll be talking about that sort of first phase of the feature request, right? Gathering the feedback, getting it from your customers, and then thinking about how that feature request might align or not with your product vision. So jumping in, the first thing we like to do, as always, is start with a poll just to get a sense of how you guys collect feedback or get feedback from your customers now. So we're curious about what are some of those ways, what are the channels, right? Is it through your app or something like a user voice tool? Is it through email support, surveys? Do you just talk to a lot of customers? Is it being driven to you or given to you by sales or something else? So maybe just give that a few more seconds. Lots of you have voted. Thank you. Okay, I think we can move on. So interestingly, a lot of the feedback is directly through customers, which is great, right? I mean, the more we get outside of our room, outside of our buildings, and talk to customers, the more we understand the feedback, where it's coming from, the needs, and obviously we get a lot of inbound feedback as well through email, support tickets, etc. Great, thank you for that. So jumping in. Go to the first slide, please. Actually, I'm not sure whether there's a build on this, but I'll roll with that. So first, have you made it easy for your customers to share feedback, right? Lots of channels, but we want to make sure that it is easy for customers to share their feedback. Ideally, like in the moment, right? Rather than as a very delayed thing months later when they've become so unhappy with your product that they're leaving, right? Like give them a way to share their thoughts while they're using your product. That gives you high quality feedback. It captures the emotion sometimes, but it's not the only way, right? So surveys, for example, are very useful, but particularly so when presented also at the right moment in your customer's experience, right? So if you care a lot about why your customers are leaving your product, which you should, then make it easy for customers to share their thoughts as to why they're leaving as part of the process of downgrading or exiting your application, right? Individual feedback is great, but it's the sort of big picture and the trends around or the patterns around the feedback that are the important ones, right? Like if lots of your customers are requesting a specific feature, great, let's capture how many, right? What that feature is, what are the patterns? Really, like you want the big picture to speak for you rather than like kind of reacting always on a one-off basis to every piece of feedback individually, because you can lose sight of what the big picture is. Every feedback is a great opportunity to have a conversation with your customer, right? Obviously, in some channels you're already talking to your customer, so great. But the focus should always be understanding what is the problem, right? Typically, feedback is expressed in terms of specific features. We want this feature, we want that feature. But it's really important to understand why the customer wants that feature. What is the problem that they actually have? What is the need? And sometimes it's not obvious. Sometimes the features that they're asking for can distract from the underlying reason. And it could be that 3 different kinds of feature requests that you're hearing actually have the same underlying problem, which obviously gives you an opportunity to solve it one way, right? And not turn your product into something very cluttered because you've implemented every single feature request that every customer has ever asked for. Finally, and really the most important thing when it comes time to decide as to what you should do with this feedback, whether you should action on it and how. And Greg is going to talk a little bit more about this in his section, but just to kind of touch on it, it's very important to understand whether the problem aligns with your product vision, right? So speaking of product vision, it's not always obvious, and next slide, please, Andre. It's not always obvious what the vision is, even like to your own team, sometimes even to yourself as a product manager, right? Like this is something that we really have to make an effort to invest in and clarifying, and words matter here, communicating those words, making it clear to your team, your support team in particular, who are highly engaged with your customers, are typically fielding a lot of these requests, right? Like they should be empowered. They should understand what our product or your product is trying to solve for whom, but also what is it not trying to solve, right? Are we trying to be that kind of a product that's going to solve that problem? It's not always a yes, right? And if it isn't a yes, then let's be clear about it. Let's make sure, at least as a team, as a product team, we understand it, our support team understands it, and ultimately your customers understand it so that they can better align with the product and use it the way it was intended, and maybe don't ask for things that are completely not in line with where the product is going. So next slide, please. Okay, so here's one example from our experience over the years of running Tracker as a product management tool. A few years ago, we rolled out a number of features that were around reporting and analytics, and so we got a lot of feedback, right? Lots of positive feedback, but of course, lots of feature requests. Like, great, you gave us reporting, but now we want more. And so one of the, in fact, the most popular feature request by far, as you can see in that little graph there in the corner, the red bar, was give us per developer productivity or performance or velocity reports. We want to know how our individual developers are performing, how much they've contributed in terms of story points, that sort of thing. Very popular feature. We could make a lot of customers happy by implementing that feature. But it turns out that this is very much not in line with our idea, our vision for Tracker as a product. And that vision is around sort of supporting and empowering teams, small teams that are cross-functional, that really work together to solve the problem and practice what we refer to as collective ownership, rather than assigning work to individuals, right, and then monitoring how the individuals are doing. We simply prioritize the work, right? Break it down, prioritize, make it very visible, and let the team sort of pull from that backlog collectively, right? Where when we estimate as a team. It's about the conversation. It's not about how many points each developer is going to deliver or be measured on, right? And if we were to implement such a feature, it would lead to probably some gamification. Developers would try to then claim the higher, or they would potentially estimate with bias toward more points because they want to get more credit, etc. So we didn't implement this. We had a lot of conversations. We communicated. We put out a blog post saying why this is not something that makes sense for us. I mean, we framed it as a explanation of what velocity is, how the tool can be used really effectively as a team. So we try to reframe it. It turns out there were some potential opportunities for implementing some things that would be not quite what people are asking for, but it would better align with our vision as well as the customer needs. So next slide, please. So the other example here is something that, if you've ever been in like a project management world, if you've ever like built your own project management app of any sort, you're probably going to hear a lot about dependencies. Everybody wants dependencies. And for years, we saw this feedback. It was like our number one sort of category of requests for years. And our reaction was always, dependencies. We're talking about Gantt charts, which is really it's complicated. It would basically turn our product into, from being a simple prioritized to-do list that's easy to reprioritize and manage, to something much more complicated where making changes to your plan would be super difficult because everything was intertwined through dependencies. But then we started to see how customers were solving their own problems, right? Or these problems. And it turns out it was more about expressing and visualizing impediments, right? Making it clear that a certain story can't be worked on because it turns out that it's waiting for something to be done as part of another story somewhere or something external to our product. And so really it was about impediments. It's about making them visible, right? And so once we finally really start to understand what the problems were, we built or designed a feature for the problem. Not story dependencies, but we built the blockers feature, which is really about capturing and making very visible what the impediments were on a story. And that's been very successful. Our customers are using it. It's very heavily used, lots of positive feedback. So we kind of look at this as an example of turning a feature request into understanding the problem and then solving for the problem. And as it turns out, this aligned with our vision quite nicely, because our vision's about, getting stories to the finish line quickly, effectively, and, clearing the path in terms of impediments. So I believe that is all I have. So back to you. Actually, one more slide, excuse me. And this is just a quick thing. Sometimes there is another option, right? You can say yes to a feature request. You can say no, it doesn't align, but there's always complementary products where the problem may align with their vision, right? So is there an opportunity to have your product work with others and kind of bring a more unified set of solutions to the table for your customers? In order for this to be possible, you obviously need to invest in integrations, or at least having a good API so other companies can build products that work with yours. And here we have exactly such an example, right? We have 3 products, including ProductPlan, Tracker, and Notion, that work well together to solve the wider spectrum of needs around product management. So with that, back to you, Andre, and thank you for the time.
Thanks, Dan. And thank you so much for being transparent and giving all of us an insight into how you at Tracker go about deciding what goes into the product. I think it was very insightful. And next up is Greg Goodman from ProductPlan. And Greg Goodman is shedding some light on, well, once you have that feedback and lots of feedback, how do I decide what I truly want to build? Greg, please take it away.
Thanks, Andre, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So before I get started on my presentation, we wanted to have a quick poll on who is primarily driving your product strategy. So if you could quickly answer the question of who you think is the most important party in your organization that's really driving your strategy. Is it customers? Is it the executive team? Is it the product management organization? A lot of times when we're talking to customers, we hear product managers complaining that they aren't necessarily in charge of their strategy. So if you could answer that question and give us some idea of kind of what your world feels like, I think that would be helpful to kind of direct where we're going up ahead. So we're getting close to the 70% response. If we can get a few more people responding, there we go. We can kick on to the next phase. So not all that surprisingly, executives is very commonly, was what I hear, is kind of setting the direction for the company, which makes product management more of kind of the implementer of things. And so that's where things kind of get tricky, when you have executives making the decisions and you're sort of having to kind of decide, is that the right strategy? So hopefully we can talk a little bit about that. Obviously customers are in there as well. And I think those are some of the push and pull that I think hopefully I'll talk about in a second. So in terms of how you deal with these different approaches of managing that different feedback, either from executives or customers. Obviously, most of you responded that it's a kind of an executive-driven roadmap for a lot of you. And others of you said, customers really drive it. Another example is, founders are really kind of have the vision like a Steve Jobs, who's like, I want to do it this way, which all of those things have their positives and negatives. And then you also get the, most frequently asked answer. But I think there's also some other approaches that we might want to take a look at. And one of them that I thought was really intriguing, that may not apply to a lot of people, but I thought it was a great story, is that there was a startup here in town, and they used Postit Notes to put them on the whiteboard. And everything that was in the upper left was high priority, and they would literally just take one off and start working on it. And everything else just kind of on the lower left, they literally would wipe out every 3 to 6 months and just throw it away, assuming that if they hadn't gotten to it in 3 to 6 months, it probably wasn't important enough. And if it comes back up later, then it'll be more important. And I think the lesson there, we'll talk about a little more further, but is that, if it's only really important if it starts coming up a lot over time. And that's another thing that I think is valuable to remember. Another way of maybe attacking the problem is by putting it in a grid system. So what this chart sort of shows is that you could graph things based on the amount of benefit it might provide and the amount of cost associated with it. And so everything in the upper left is something that has a high benefit or a low cost. And that's probably your best win. So things that you can get out that really have a lot of impact on your customers, your organization. And that might be a way of talking to your executives about here's some things that we should concentrate on. Things in the lower right quadrant are probably things you really don't want to do. So they might have a high cost, but not a lot of benefit. And then those two other quadrants are really interesting in terms of contrast. So the one on the upper right is high benefit, but high cost. So things that might be hard to build, might take a lot of time, but would really have a lot of value to your customers. And I would encourage you to have those as your next priority versus the ones in the lower left. The lower left ones tend to be kind of the candy, the eye candy stuff, or the easy low-hanging fruit stuff that may not really give you the bite that your customers really want. It might not move the needle enough for you. So I'd be careful not to go too many in that lower quadrant. So that's another way of looking at it and trying to make it more objective. What we do at ProductPlan is we actually have a feature of our product that we take advantage of called the planning board. And we've talked with other customers that use it in a spreadsheet or other ways, so you don't have to use our product to do it necessarily. But what I think the real value is in doing something like this is it really causes you to have a more objective approach to it rather than a lot of subjectivity to it. So if you come up with some columns that represent your benefit and other columns that represent your costs, and then scale it. We use a 1 to 5 scale, but you could use whatever you want. And then we have several people vote on it. So it might be an executive person, it might be a product person, it might be engineering. And they each vote independently. And then we compare those at the end and try to get an idea of, well, why did you have it so highly benefited? Why do you think this really going to help us increase revenue? Or why is this an important customer value? Or maybe this is a really competitive advantage for us. Why do you think that way? Because you had a 5 and I had a 1. And so it's really helpful to kind of clear up the reasoning of why people want something as a higher priority. And I think that really helps solve some of those subjective questions and try to make it a little more objective on the discussion. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a framework to talk about in terms of how to kind of balance those suggestions coming in from customers and those needs for your vision and maybe your executive team. So let's talk a little bit more of a concrete example about a feature that we were struggling with. And what's funny is this kind of came up when Dan's team came out with the blocker feature. He and I had a conversation about it because when it came out, we're a customer for Pivotal Tracker, and our development team was very excited about this blocking feature. And the engineers are very excited about new features, and this one was something that they really thought had a lot of value to them. But what I immediately saw when I saw this blocker feature that came out with is it was a dependency feature, which is something our customers have been asking for a while. But our vision didn't really align with kind of what our customers were asking. So our customers were asking for a way of drawing a line between a bar and another bar. But our vision is more around creating a easy to use, easy to communicate product strategy tool, and something that executives can digest and understand and not have it be so project managing and not be like a Gantt chart. But we've been around for almost 4 years now, and we've had customers ask, about dependencies. And each time they would ask, we would kind of try to dive a little deeper into what they really wanted. And it wasn't a high priority because for us, what we were hearing is drawing lines and having bars move, and that really didn't align with what we wanted to do. But as we dove a little deeper with those customer questions, we started understanding that what the problem was that they were just trying to communicate that this item can't, has some things that are associated with it that are called dependencies that cause it to either be scheduled in a certain way or that has impact on the items that I'm working on. So it's a way of communicating that. So we went back to the whiteboard and decided to kind of take a harder look at what we wanted to build. And so we looked at some alternatives of how we could represent this visually for our customers so that they could communicate that. Because again, it's important as part of our product vision that we had something visually to display for this. And then we started talking to customers with these different mock-ups. And we were able to understand some of the things that we got right and some of the things we got wrong. Some of it was around naming. And it was interesting when I was talking to Dan and his conversation about how they came to the word blockers really encouraged us to go a little further with our discussion about what we were going to call this thing, because our customers called it dependencies, but it just didn't feel ring true to what we wanted to do within our product. And we tried other things like connectors and relationships, and we ended up settling on something called connections. And so here's an example of what that feature looks like. And this feature actually isn't released yet. It's something that we have under development, and I wanted to share with you kind of the process. And as a good product manager, I'm not going to tell you when it's going to be delivered, but it hopefully will happen in the near future. So look forward to it. But the main driver is that we really didn't want to develop the product or this feature until we really had it down. And when we started showing it to customers and they said, wow, that is super elegant, that solves our issue. When we started hearing that from our prototypes, and when one customer said, that looks like something Apple would have developed, we had some idea that we probably got it close to where we really wanted it to be. And so while we didn't develop it right off the bat when we had a lot of people asking for it, it really slipped down our list because we just didn't really understand how we could do it and have it fit with our product vision. I think we've ended up with something that will really help our customers long term. So in summarizing kind of what I think is valuable with balancing all of those different pieces with your customer requests and your executives, I think these are the things that you should be thinking about. First of all, have an open mind. So I think that's a really valuable thing. So, we kept hearing the same thing, but we weren't necessarily willing to dive in immediately until we knew that we had it right. So I think that's the second thing, which is make sure you're happy about what you're delivering and that it kind of fits with your gut and with what your alignment is for your product vision. I don't think your product should be a democracy. So I don't think you should be just letting all your votes come in and you have to do everything. I think you really have to concentrate on a product market fit for your product and what's really aligned with your product vision and how you want to move your product forward. I think having forethought around where you're going is also really important, because you don't want to add a feature that you're going to have to maintain over time that becomes just tech debt for you that you have to keep around forever because you met some customer's need. So make sure that as you're designing it and building it, that it has a long-term future for what you're doing. And I think for us with that connections feature, we have some other ideas on how we can use it in other ways that really will give us some advantage. So I think we structured it in a way and we talked about it in a certain way that it'll really help us going forward in other areas as well. And then lastly, I think it's really important to be able to say no to customers. And so like customers wanted us to draw a line and move those bars. And I don't think we're going to be doing the move part. And the reason why is because let's say you have this connection between one bar on one roadmap and one bar on another, and they're controlled by two different people. And suddenly that person moves something and suddenly something on your roadmap moves. And you didn't even really know why or what. And so we just don't really feel like that's the appropriate behavior. We think that you should maybe learn that this thing has moved or have some other way of visualizing it, which I think we'll work on in the future. We have some ideas for that will really lend itself to that, but rather than having it a fixed move. So I think that saying no part is a really important thing. And I think you can say soft nose and I think you can say hard nose. And hard nose are important so your customers can decide if it's the right product for them, because it may not be the right product for them. You have a certain market that you want to attack and you can't necessarily attack everyone. So with that, hopefully that gives you some idea of how to approach that balance between customers and strategy and vision. And I'll send it back to Andre. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Greg. So now that what was fascinating to me, it seems like everybody wants dependencies. That's kind of odd. But now that you hopefully know how to mesh the request with the vision, and hopefully Greg helped you and give you some tips how then to decide what to build. Next up is Kevin from Notion, and he will tell you how to use metrics to align product strategy against those feature requests. Kevin, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Andre. And thanks, Dan and Greg. I think you guys both did a great job of kind of setting the stage of some real live examples from building out your products. And I was watching the questions come in during that and saw questions that people were asking around how do we measure this, how do we find patterns that kind of led to those decisions, which are great questions that everyone should be asking. How do you identify patterns within the feedback you're getting, and B, those are great questions because that's what I'm about to talk about. So this hopefully rounds out nicely for everybody. But like everyone else, let's start with a quick poll. So what are the biggest challenges you face when evaluating evaluation of a feature request. This only pick one. You know, there might be multiple things here that you come against, but really we're looking for just kind of what is the biggest challenge? Is it, you know, where does it fit in the roadmap? How much is it going to cost to build? How does it align with our current vision? How many customers want this? And then, you know, is it more important than what we're already building? So I'm sure those are all common things that everyone is facing. So we'll get a couple more answers in here. Cool. So yeah, the biggest one there is this more important than what we're already building? I didn't really have any expectations as to how people were going to answer this, so I find that interesting. But I think what is really interesting to me is kind of an even spread amongst the rest here. And I asked this question to really, as a comfort factor for everyone here to know that you're not alone. Everyone faces these same problems. There's not some big secret that we all know and we just haven't told you about yet. You know, these are challenges that everyone's facing. But so I'm hoping to give you a couple tips and tricks to use metrics and data to be able to track and help, you know, face these challenges. Next slide. Cool. So yeah, to kind of set the stage here, I want to explain a little framework we use here at Notion when we're dealing with feature requests. So whenever a feature request comes in, you need to evaluate it. You have to be aware of the 6 different versions of your product. And what that means are, you know, there's the version that your customer bought. There's the version that you just shipped. Now, technically, those might be the exact same thing, depending on where in the life cycle the product is and the customer bought it. But if you're, you know, most software development companies these days are shipping every couple weeks, every couple months. You know, these windows might be pretty close and expand as you go. Then there's the version you're working on next, right? The day you ship, maybe you have a party, but next day, that afternoon, you're already starting on what's next. And then you have your long-term vision, right? So you have your roadmap, whether it's a 3, 6, you know, 12-month, or if it's a 1, 3, 5 year. You have some visibility into where you want this to go. But then there's also the customer's long-term vision, right? Like, what is their desire for your product? Where do they think it's going to go? And you obviously want that gap between those two visions to be as narrow as possible, so that there's the proper alignment. That means you're setting the correct stage. But then you run the risk, next slide, Andre, of, you know, when a feature request does come in, of trying to decide where does that fit, right? Like, what version of the product are they actually talking about? Is this feature request the result of a bug that maybe something that we just shipped, or maybe it's a feature that no one really thought about until we introduced some new ability to do a feature? You know, and is that going to take us off course, or does it kind of align with what we're doing? So I'm going to walk through a couple examples of metrics that you can be tracking that will help you kind of answer that question of, you know, where does this feature request really fit? How can we evaluate it internally, even if it's just on the product team itself, before you take it to the executives, before you for buy off to start building it, before you take it to the dev team to give them full explanation or understanding as to why we're going to build this next, if it's making a change to your roadmap or not. So next slide. So yeah, if you're kind of looking at that gap between, you know, the version your customer bought and the version you just shipped, the question you're kind of asking yourself is, did we build the right thing? And so when a feature request comes in, you're kind of always nervous, like oh shoot, like we just shipped X, but now they're already asking for Y. And so one way to kind of track, you know, the things that you have been building and are people using them is kind of just a standard just feature adoption, right? And so one way to do that is, you know, just by pure user count, right? And so trending that data over time to see, you know, in this example here, you can see, you know, this is like for a photo gallery app. So users are posting photos and posting videos, but they're not really printing, they're not exporting, you know, so those features, maybe you built them early on in the product lifecycle thinking that they were going to be used or popular, but there's kind of no adoption there. So at that point, that's where you can start to ask questions around, as a request comes in for, hey, we wish we had the ability to print photos, you can kind of say, well, that's an outlier. We don't really have that user base. And so you can kind of instantly bucket that. And so going back to the kind of the framework Greg had, that's a sticky note that's going to go pretty low on the whiteboard because you just don't have the current user base for it. Another way to look at feature adoption, I have the formula down there in the right corner. You can look at, sorry, Andre, go back. Cool. You can look at feature adoption as like a percentage of your user base, right? So take the number of users who did a feature or are using a feature, completed an action, whatever it might be, and then just divide that by the total number of users you have. And so typically you're going to want to set baselines for that then, like maybe we want 25%, 50%, 100% of all of our users doing a certain action or using a certain feature. And that will help you, again, to kind of weigh as a feature request comes in based on something that you've already shipped. If it's like an update to it, you'll be able to start evaluate it by saying, well, only 30% of our users are interested in this area of the product, and we only want to build things for features that 75% of the more customers are adopting. So those are some good metrics you can track there. Okay, now next. And so the other question is then, are we building the right thing next, right? So I saw a couple questions come in of just like, how do you look for patterns in your feature requests, right? And those patterns will help you start to identify the next things that you should be building. And so one way we do this here is we track feature requests. We use Intercom to collect the data. That's where the majority of our feature requests come through. We do get some through email and customer conversations as well, but we tag those, right? All those conversations can be tagged in Intercom. And then actually in Notion, our tool, we can pull those tags in. And so you get charts like this, where you can see those feature requests trended over time, right? So how many people are asking for a specific feature. And so you can see what, the ability to add captions was super popular. So, you're seeing a lot of requests per day for that, but then it shipped and all of a sudden people started asking for the ability to edit captions, right? And maybe that wasn't on the radar, but all of a sudden by introducing this new feature, people have started to now request a feature immediately to follow it. So are you building that next, or did you actually move on to other things thinking you're gonna, buy yourself some time just by having captions? Another way to think of this, I don't have a chart to show it, but maybe you hear a ton of people requesting a certain feature, you can trend that over time. But then if you don't have the time in the roadmap and well, we're not going to get to that for another 6 months, in 6 months when it's time to build that, go back to this chart and see, are people still asking for it, right? It's very possible that it was like a hot topic item 6 months ago, but other features that you have released have since, alleviated that need for that other feature. And now building it at that moment in time could be the wrong thing to build because no one's asking for it anymore. So yeah, trending feature requests over time are a great way to get visibility there. Next. And then, does it align with your vision, right? And what is the cost? Another popular question that's been popping up during the previous talks here is, how do we really decide if we're going to build this? What's it going to cost, right? And so those are questions like, what's not just the cost to build, but what's the cost to maintain it? And also, how does it affect our MRR, right? Is this something we really should be building? Is this a large customer who is asking for one bespoken feature that only they are going to be able to use, or is this something that we can build out and all of our customers are going to build, so we know that we have that ability to grow revenue as a result of this feature being released, or is only one customer going to do it? So you have your standard, dev metrics, dev performance metrics that you should be tracking, things like throughput, velocity, cycle times, right? Like these things help you kind of identify bottlenecks within your workflow, and will give you the ability to better understand kind of expected delivery, right? So when it's your job to communicate features out, if a feature request comes in and everyone on the sales team is, hot on this idea and pushing on you to build it, you can come back to them with these metrics and say, well, look, this type of feature, it's 10 points, right? Or whatever this scope of it is. And then you can point to these metrics and say, here's the things, this is how fast our dev team is currently moving. Here's the things we already have in the pipeline. To build this feature out, it's going to take X amount of time, right? Or we're not going to be able to start this for X amount of time. And so that helps, just start that communication of aligning vision internally, right? But then also being able to communicate it externally to your customers around delivery or any type of expectation of to whether or not that feature is going to be built. Another way of looking at that then is the blue formula I have down the bottom there is like, what's the true cost of building? Like physically, what does it cost in dollars? And so one way to do that is take your total dev team salary, right? And you want to divide it by your velocity. So if you're tracking your velocity every 2 weeks, then you want your salaries to be like, what's their 2-week salary? What that results with is like a physical like dollar amount of cost per point, right? And that's not a metric that should be used as like a whip where you're trying to get it to be as low as possible. It should really just be about just pure transparency and decision making around, it's going to cost us X amount just to physically build this thing. Is that worth our time, right? Like if it's going to cost $10,000 to build, but we can only expect $3,000 in revenue from it, right? That should help you decide whether or not that's a great thing to build. So these are a couple metrics you can do to kind of help kind of align those visions. Just to bring this back up so everyone can see it one final time. As your feature requests come in, right, by tracking metrics related to these different versions of your product, it's very important to your kind of like build, measure, learn cycle. And so as you're building new things, you always want to be setting goals, setting targets for those features as they release, always going back to those benchmarks, paying attention to your roadmap, paying attention to how long it's taking to build things, so that as these feature requests come in, you have a better sense of where does it really fit into your roadmap, and is it something we're going to address soon or not? Thanks. Back to you, Andre.
Right on. Thanks so much, Kevin. I'm a big believer in having all of your decisions guided by data. So I think those were some awesome recommendations. Thanks so much. So we arrived, in my opinion, at the most interesting part of a webinar. That's the time when you can grill the speakers and submit your questions. I saw lots and lots of questions coming in. Thank you so much. Please continue to submit questions. I made sure that all the speakers do not need to go back to work after this webinar, and they have all afternoon to answer all your questions coming in. So please continue to put questions in, and we're trying to go through as many as possible. So that's your chance to chime in. All right. So the first question, Dan, I think this one is a good one for you. The question is, how do you prioritize features and how do you assign points?
Thank you, Andre. The eternal good question, always. It sort of covers the entire spectrum in a sense, but I think we talked, in this webinar, we talked a little about, I know Greg focused a lot on, putting some practices into play that help you make, reasonably objective decisions as far as which features or which problems to solve. And, there are many tools for that. In fact, ProductPlan has a tool built in, right, that allows you to evaluate, a list of potential features or solutions against some dimensions, right, that basically are about, benefits, impact, as well as cost. There are others. Intercom has a model that they promote. It's called the RICE model, which is a bit more biased toward finding the smallest sort of incremental wins as far as your problems go, or the feature requests. So there's many ways, right? You have to have a method. You have to try to make it as objective as possible, but you have to consider all of the inputs, right? Like, who is this for? If your executives are breathing down your neck, then obviously that's a dimension to consider. And I would just, include that in the process and say, okay, how many executives are asking for this, right? That's one dimension to consider. How many customers are asking for this? That's another dimension, right? How much does this align with our vision? Is this going to increase revenue? So there's always multiple things to consider, and it's hard to do this, by yourself as a product manager. So you have to try and include all of the people that are, going to be stakeholders in some regard, right? And communicate around why you made those decisions. Then, as far as estimation, this happens more I think there's multiple levels of estimation. There's typically sort of a high level guess as to how big a feature is. T-shirt sizes are commonly used for this. We tend to look at things in terms of well, pair weeks, pairs, because at Pivotal, everybody pairs programs, so we always count developers in pairs, right? So we say this is roughly a 12 pair week initiative, right? It's just a guess, you know, the reality will be probably longer or larger. It always is, but at least it gives you some relative sense to compare. And that's all you can do at the level of roadmap planning. And then once you get into the tactical mode where you're breaking down a feature into small stories, right? That's when you're estimating in actual points as a team to uncover different assumptions, to get everybody on the same page, right? And to try and keep your granularity, you know, super high. So small stories, right? That's where estimation comes in later.
Thanks, Dan. Greg, I think the next one is a good one for you. You touched a little about this in your presentation. Can you address the strategic importance of saying no?
Well, who are you saying no to, an executive or a customer? I think it depends on a lot of things, right? And I'll give that example of our dependencies feature. We weren't really saying no to customers. We might have been, I think, for a long time, because like I said, we heard it for several years. So it wasn't so much that we were saying no, as we were still kind of gathering, like, how do we do this? You know, so it was more of something like, yep, that's something that we'll consider for our backlog. And we hadn't really prioritized it. But I think there's other times when you can say actually no, when you know very clearly we're probably not going to be doing that thing. But you know, we might look at this sort of thing. So I mean, I think it really just depends on the situation and the phase of the company. Early on, you should be listening very, very closely to what your customers are saying. I think that's the biggest mistake of startups and new products, is thinking that you know it really well, and when in reality you're on the right track, but you really need to find good market fit too. So I think that's a key element, is where your customers really do have probably a bigger say, is early on. Later on, I think it really comes down to vision and strategy and where you're going long term with the product. And so for us on that example, we might be saying no on the actual showing of lines, but maybe we come up with some other way of visualizing that isn't actually on the physical roadmap. And that's something we're considering. So hopefully that helps you talk about, you know, how do you say no, or when do you say no?
Thanks, Greg. Kevin, can you take the next question? The question is, at what point should your product strategy shift due to customer requests?
Sure. Tough question. And I guess, you know, the generic response is it depends. Kind of, you know, have you found product market fit or not? And if you have, then the way you need to evaluate those types of requests are going to be very different than if you haven't. And so let's start with if you haven't found product market fit. There's other assumptions you have to make, or I have to make in answering this, right? Like, so let's say you're a startup. How much research have you done? How much planning have you done? Or how tied to the vision of your initial product do you have, right? And if you think that we're going to set out and build X, and we have it all scoped out, and we've talked with enough potential customers, and they've identified this as a real problem solution, then how true do you want to stay to that? And if you're going to get, because you're always going to get feature requests that will kind of direct you the other way. You need to bring those in and say, is this a one-off? Are we getting this from, you know, multiple users? Are all of our customers pointing us this way? Or what's the potential of that, right? Maybe your initial product is only selling to, you know, the kind of like the middle of the funnel, but all of a sudden now, you know, people are asking for something that's going to take you upstream a lot more, and now you're selling bigger deals to bigger clients. Is that where you want to move to? The answer could and should be yes, but at the same time, maybe you want to stay true to the lower end of the market that you're serving. So then the same thing happens when you're at product market fit, right? Is what is your potential for growth? Have you hit that ceiling yet of, you know, we're trying to sell something to, you know, all small, medium businesses. How much of that market have we captured, right? And is now the time for us to start moving upstream and selling to these enterprise customers, or is that going to, you know, decrease our focus in the fact that we haven't really locked up this segment of the market that we want to go after yet. That is our current bread and butter. And if we start working in a new section or a new vertical, our competitor is going to come in and start beating us out, right? And so those are all things that kind of, it's a evaluation process that you have to do kind of constantly. And I hope, again, some of my slides, I think, can address that if you're identifying where those feature requests are coming into your overall vision and your customer's vision.
Thanks, Kevin. Dan, can you take this one? The question is, how do you close the feedback loop with your customers? Whether it's a feature you move forward with, or more importantly, one you did not implement.
Great question. I would say the first part of that is a lot easier than the second one, right? How do you close the loop when the answer is no or maybe? And unfortunately, the easiest answer or the default answer in most cases is maybe, right? Because you're not ready to close the door on something, and so there is no kind of discrete point at which it's time to close the loop, right? And all you can do is say, look, this is something that we're considering, right? And keep an eye on our product blog or future updates. The yes part of it, closing the loop for features that you have actually implemented, that obviously requires that you've sort of kept track of all of the requests, all the customers who have asked for a certain thing or have requests or have shared that they have a certain problem. So I think some tooling and process around that is important. What we do is we actually forward all of the specific requests from our support ticket and other places, emails, etc., into Tracker. We turn them into stories. We use Tracker to organize those stories into epics, which give us the sort of groupings of kind of problem areas or themes or specific features, if that's what it comes down to. And so when we actually release something, our support team, as part of kind of the normal process, will go through every single request that was tied to that feature, and also just grouping or tagging in your support system, your ticket system is a good way to do this, right? But we actually go through every single request that was for that feature or for that problem, and we follow up. And usually the customers really appreciate that we took the time to say, hey, by the way, we just wanted to let you know that we've implemented this. And that's obviously on top of or beyond the normal kind of feature rollout communication, blog post, Twitter, etc. For the no's, to the extent that we've kind of made a decision on not implementing something, we at least make it part of the ongoing kind of response to that feature going forward, right? So we give some rationale, and people usually appreciate that. But we haven't been that great at following up on all the people who requested in the past when we make that decision to say no. So I think that's something we could all do better with.
Yeah, good advice, Dan. I think communication is important and transparency is key. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Greg, the next one is probably a good one for you. This question is around vision. Vision is a vague word. Can you discuss the anatomy of product vision to clarify how to apply this term?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think vision is something that changes over time. It shouldn't change like a lot, but I think it is something that you need to go back to and make sure that you're clear on. And I think there's several components to coming up with your vision. I think it's something your team needs to agree on. So if your executive team has one vision and your product and engineering team and marketing and sales have different visions, I think it's really important that you as a group decide where are we going. So as long as if you don't have alignment across your organizations of where you're going with your product, I think that requires either some offsites or some meetings to determine, what are the differentiators? What are the things that we need to do? And what is the direction of our product need to take in order for it to be successful in the market and with our customers and for it to continue to grow both sales-wise and customer-wise? So I would say it's a collection of things. If it's something that resonates with your customer, I think that's really key. So for us, we're trying to listen to what are the things that why they're deciding to buy our product. And one of the ones that we hear about regularly is the ease of use. So when we're looking at new features, one part of our vision is how do we incorporate that in a way that makes it easy to use, that's elegant, that's not overcomplicated. And so that we might use things like progressive disclosure, where things are kind of hidden until you need them. So the product doesn't feel complicated or doesn't have the complexity that maybe some people are asking for, but only until you kind of really need to get there is it important to you. So it might be things that are more hidden behind other areas, or you use user UX design to kind of make it a more elegant experience.
Thanks, Greg. Kevin, can you talk a little about how you organize and find patterns in the feedback? What tools and methods? What do you use for that?
Sure. So we use Intercom internally here, and so you can tag things. You can create segments based around users that have asked for certain features. So I think that's a great place to start. I know kind of any of the tools that are using for customer feedback will typically have a tag feature. I think what's important about that to remember is try to identify a hierarchy of your tags up front. What you don't want is a bunch of random tags, or if you have a large support team, everyone come up with their own tags, because then you're going to get things that should be grouped together and may be a large component of the feature request, but they're scattered across 7 or 8 different tags that more or less all mean the same thing. So what's more important than the tool is kind of the system that you and the team decide on and use. But I know Dan and the Tracker team, they use Tracker to kind of capture that feedback, right? And they plot it right in there. It allows them to kind of keep it in the same location that they're then using to build the dev team works off of. So you can get creative with the tools. It does not have to be a very specific customer feedback tool itself. If you're collecting a lot of things through conversations, whether that's email or face-to-face conversations, through polling or surveys that you send out, we use Airtable as well, and I think that's a great tool to kind of set up your own database, but it's very visual, easy to organize. It's much more flexible than, say, a spreadsheet. If you know how to use a spreadsheet, you're going to know how to use Airtable, but you'll learn and discover a lot more powerful features, tagging, sorting, filtering, that again will make it easy if you have that system set up the right way. Like if you agree upon, these are the set tags we're going to use, these are the areas of the product that a feature request might be about, here's where the customer is in the life cycle, right? Is this feedback from a prospect? Is this feedback from a VIP customer? Is this feedback from a new customer, long-term customer? All of those labels and details that you can provide will help you kind of sift through all that data to figure out, what is the right next thing to build.
Right on. Thanks for giving us a look in your toolbox, Kevin.
Yep.
The next question is probably a good question for both Dan or Greg. Dan, why don't you take a shot at it? So the question is, what methods did you use to identify and understand the underlying problems? The example is dependencies versus impediments.
Yeah, happy to take a stab at this. I think there are multiple levels of understanding, right? The first level is like you're receiving all these requests. Maybe you can follow up a little bit and clarify, okay, why do you need this, etc. Then there is sort of, like I said, observing how customers are actually working now, and like really to try get at the bottom of the problem. And I think for that requires a little bit more of an investment. And for us, I remember there's a few times when I was at a customer, as well as with some customers at a Pivotal office, where of course Tracker is used very heavily, and we started noticing that everybody's using this this Chrome extension that would color certain labels based on the terms in that label, like blocked or needs or something. It would color those labels red so they would stand out, and then we actually had a chance to talk to some of the teams that were using that, and it really kind of opened our eyes to what the problem really was, right? But I think in general, to truly understand, you have to have conversations, right? And you do have to sometimes actually observe and watch your customers use your product, because only then will you really understand, and then you can sort of start thinking about how to solve them. So that's my my take at it.
Right on. Thanks, Dan. Greg, why don't you take this one? The question is how to go about translating different requests into the underlying question that needs to be solved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a big portion of it is asking the why, right? So a lot of times people will tell you what they want, and you need to dive a little deeper into the why they want it and what's the benefit of it for them, or what's the problem that they're having that they needed that thing. So when you start understanding the motivations and the different actors that might be involved and what the problem is, then you can start formulating what the best approach is for doing it. I saw another question actually that sort of related to that. Like, you get a bunch of requests and how do you handle it? And I think there's a couple of ways. You can either wait for kind of them to accumulate over time, and the ones that appear more regularly are probably the ones that you need to respond to the quickest, but also being able to pepper in things periodically. So I think it's really valuable in your product that you have a balance between like long-term projects, little things, and that's another area that we try to do occasionally, where we have maybe bigger stuff that we're concentrating on, so getting out a feature every 2 weeks, but also peppering in things. So making sure you have a balance of both, maybe, and we haven't really talked about tech debt or maintenance or any of those other things that need to be peppered in as well. But I think making sure that you have a blend of those things rather than concentrating on just one area of the product.
Right on. Thanks, Greg. And now we are over the top of the hour. I see a few people dropping out, and we're cutting into lunch hour on the West Coast. So why don't we do this as the last question? Kevin, you have the honor to answer this last question. The question is, how do you tie internal tools to revenue? Or what metrics do you use outside of revenue if it's not possible to make that link?
Okay. How do you tie internal tools to revenue? I mean, I guess if you're, are we talking about using a tool and the benefit that it has for your overall revenue? I think, do you have insight there, Andre?
I mean, it's up to our interpretation. So, okay. I mean, my guess is different tools available to product managers, how they track revenue. For example, we are ProductPlan use Recurly in order for billing, and I know there is some intricacies in order to tie all those different tools together. And sometimes it can be a bit hard, in my opinion, to always report easily on revenue. Being a marketer, that's actually a problem that I personally have. And at the end of the day, everything should be determined by revenue. But I totally understand and relate to this question. It's not always easy. And so what's your opinion about making connections among different tools and making data easily accessible to people for then product managers to make good decisions? That's how I would interpret that question.
I would actually, just to jump in briefly, I might actually interpret it differently, and perhaps we can answer both interpretations, where the other interpretation is, if you're product managing a tool that's internal to an organization, right, where you're not actually generating revenue, but you need to quantify the value and tie that to some of these decisions around investments and prioritization decisions, right? That's a different problem, but that may be what the person is asking.
Got it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Let's go with that first. I mean, I think, and Dan, you might want to jump in after this, because I think Tracker is kind of a success story of that. But if you are building an internal tool, the way you can tie the value of that tool to, whether it's helping your team develop your actual product, or if it's, helping streamline any part of your company process. I think what you want to do is look at, what are the areas that it is touching, right? And so let's take development specifically. If you're building an internal ticket management tool for your dev team to use, you can tie it to their productivity, right? Like, as that tool improves, or as you spend more time on it, is the team benefiting from it, right? Is throughput going up? Is velocity going up? Is it like, what are the metrics that you as a team have identified these things mean we are productive. This defines our productivity, and these are the targets that we're trying to get to with them, right? Like saying velocity goes up isn't always just the right thing. Maybe maintaining velocity is important to you, or just not seeing any dip in velocity. So I think that's one way you can kind of tie. The other is, rather than looking at it as revenue, look at it as cost, right? Like what is the cost of building that tool internally? How much time does it take? What's the dev hours on it? What are the costs of those dev hours? And then just kind of like, what is the long-term budget for that, and is that increasing or decreasing over time as the tool itself improves, and as if your team doubles in size, can that tool support it, or are you now going to have to double or triple the spend on that internal tool? I think those are some of the metrics you want to be tracking from that side of it. I hope that makes sense.
Got it. Dan, do you want to also share your thoughts on it, or?
Sure, just maybe a couple. I think generally speaking, it's easier to do the latter, right, of what Kevin was talking about, and treat internal tools as a cost center, right? And then sort of having a conversation and making a case for what the budget should be, given the benefit, given the value, and maybe it's an operational benefit, maybe it's an efficiency benefit, right? Obviously, you're going to want to quantify what is the value that the tool provides for your organization, and then be able to measure that, right? Because that's what finance is going to ask you. Great, we understand the inherent value of this tool to our organization, but how are we measuring that, right? They're always going to want to measure it. It tends to be difficult to quantify internal tools in dollars, because finance is not going to have it, right? There's no place in an accounting system to put a dollar value in something that doesn't actually bring revenue, unless you can make the case and you can actually say, look, we are getting more customers because of the presence of this tool, and come up with some sort of an attachment model that says, here's how many new customers to whom this internal tool was indirectly a factor, right? But you have to come up with a model, right, and then be able to kind of back it up with some measurement, some evidence that that value continues to be provided. And having a fixed budget, like once you sort of agree on what what is the perceived or real value to your organization, based on that, you feel a budget or a need, sort of a steady state need of this many developers, a product manager, et cetera, is what's required to do a good job of it, right? And you have to sell that to finance, obviously. But once you've agreed, then that becomes kind of a constraint that you have to work within as a product manager, right? This is the resources that we have, this is the budget, and so we have to prioritize with that in mind, and it actually kind of makes it easier to make decisions because you have this hard constraint.
Got it. Well, thanks for sharing your thoughts. All right, we went a little bit over. I appreciate that everybody was staying on and participated so lively. We got several hundred questions. Thank you so much. Of course, we weren't able to go through all of them, but I hope we picked some good ones. And I would encourage you to also go to our free public Slack account, theproductstack.com, and put those questions in there and help each other. And maybe some other product managers can answer the question if we were not able to answer them today. So just go to theproductstack.com and sign up for free. And then we also try to pick a few more questions and put a blog post out early next week. All the three companies, Notion, Pivotal Tracker, and ProductPlan, we have a blog. If you haven't checked it out, I would highly recommend checking it out. And you will probably see some of those questions that you asked today being answered on our blog. And then we will post the recording of this webinar probably within just a few hours. And you can then watch this recorded webinar or pass it along to a colleague who would enjoy it. Everybody who signed up and everybody who attended will get an email tomorrow with the link to the recording. And again, I really appreciate that several hundreds of people attended live today. And I very much appreciate all the questions that everybody shared and asked. And most of all, thank you to the three speakers, Dan, Kevin, and Greg, for sharing not only your insights, but also giving a bit of a behind-the-scenes look into what truly was a challenge or what truly was the case for you. So thank you very much. I think it was a fantastic webinar.
Thanks, Andre. Thanks, Dan and Kevin.
All right.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.